A mother says being at the wrong place at the wrong time has upended her life in ways she never expected.
She says she was falsely accused of murder after visiting a mall in Rolling Hills Estates the same day a retired nurse was found stabbed to death there.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
On May 3, 2018, a quiet parking lot in Rolling Hills, California, became the stage for a crime that would haunt the community for years to come. Susan Leeds, a 66-year-old retired nurse, had spent her day shopping, perhaps unaware that the routine she had followed countless times before would soon be interrupted. Her final moments, filled with the simplicity of everyday life, would soon be overshadowed by a brutal act that shattered everything. For Susan, it was supposed to be a simple day. A trip to the mall, a few items on her list, and a quiet drive home. But for Sherry Townsend, a mother caught in a web of financial strain and desperation, it was the beginning of a twisted plan that would alter the course of both of their lives forever. Two lives, completely unaware of the tragic turn fate was about to take. For over 2 hours, Sherry Townsend lay in wait. Her mind clouded by the desperate need to keep a promise to her daughter, a promise she could no longer afford to fulfill. The pressure to make it all right, to escape the overwhelming debt and responsibilities, was mounting with every passing minute. And then, in an instant, everything would change. 5 years after the murder of Susan Leeds, the case that had stumped investigators for so long was suddenly reignited. Sherry Townsend, once free, now found herself facing a courtroom where the stakes were higher than ever. Her story, once filled with claims of innocence, now stood at the precipice of an inevitable truth. But for the investigators and for the Leeds family, the long search for answers had been a tormenting journey, filled with false leads, confusion, and a constant tug-of-war between what was real and what was not. A woman with no apparent enemies. A life of service, a career spent caring for others, and yet, here she is, a victim in a place most people consider safe. Why would someone want to kill her? What could have driven a person to commit such an act in broad daylight, in a public place, no less? What would make a life of routine and stability be snuffed out so violently, so unexpectedly? The quiet of the mall's parking lot was shattered in a moment. What had seemed like a routine day would unravel a web of desperation, lies, and the unthinkable. Across town, Sherry Lynette Townsend, a 47-year-old mother, is facing her own financial crisis. She, too, had been at the mall that day. Her car, a gold sedan, was seen leaving the parking garage, the same one where Leeds had been found bleeding. A simple coincidence, perhaps? Or something more? Townsend, it seems, was a woman under pressure. Her daughter, just 14, was on a cheerleading team, and she had promised her daughter a trip to Florida, a dream that seemed impossible for a mother struggling to pay the bills. To many, a trip to Florida seemed like a small thing. But to a mother facing a mountain of debt, it became an obsession. A chance to escape her failures, a chance to give her daughter something she could never afford. But for Sherry Townsend, it would come at a far greater cost. As the days pass, the pieces of the puzzle begin to come together. The investigators find themselves drawn to Townsend's car. It's seized as evidence, but when they search it, they find nothing of significance. No clues. No murder weapon. But the phone. The phone was the key. It was found under Leeds' car, discarded, as if Townsend had carelessly dropped it there. A small detail, perhaps, but the implications were huge. How did her phone end up at the crime scene? Was this a mistake, or was it a sign of something more deliberate? And then the confession, or rather, the denial. Townsend was interviewed, and in an attempt to explain away the evidence, she claimed she didn't know how her phone ended up in the parking structure. But her story didn't quite add up. In fact, it fell apart under questioning. She had visited a Verizon store to try and track down her phone, but the story of her phone being misplaced seemed hollow. The investigators had already pieced together that her phone pinged off towers in the area where she had been seen, heading in the direction of the crime scene. But it was her inconsistent story that truly raised red flags. For now, Townsend would walk free. She was arrested, but released soon after. She sued the county, claiming her innocence. But the wheels of justice were turning slowly. Justice, it seemed, was elusive. Townsend would walk free for now, but the investigation wasn't over. The truth wasn't buried, it was just waiting to be uncovered. 5 years passed, and the case grew cold. But in August of 2023, just when it seemed like the case would be forgotten, Townsend was arrested again. This time, the charges stuck. The investigation had never truly stopped. New evidence, new methods, and new insights brought the case back to life. Townsend was finally facing the consequences of her actions. But the question remained, was she truly guilty of this crime? Was the evidence enough to convict her, or was she just another person caught in the web of circumstantial evidence? As the chapter closes, the viewers are left hanging on the edge, caught in the swirling mystery of the case. What will happen to Sherry Townsend? Was she the killer? Or was there someone else waiting in the wings, someone whose motives are still hidden? The story is far from over, but for now, we leave the mall parking structure behind. In the quiet of that parking lot, a life was taken, and a mystery was born. The answers may never come easy, but the search for them will continue. For Susan Leeds, the truth remains buried in the shadows of that day, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon on May 3, 2018, when Susan Leeds, a 66-year-old retired nurse, left the promenade on the Peninsula Mall in Rolling Hills, California. The sunlight was soft, casting a golden hue over the mall's parking structure. Susan had just finished shopping, her typical routine. She picked up a few groceries, some takeout food, her hands full, her mind elsewhere. She was a woman used to caring for others, having spent her entire career as a nurse, offering help to those in need. But on this day, Susan would need care, and there would be no one around to offer it. She was walking back to her car, unaware that someone else's desperation was lurking in the shadows, ready to alter the course of her life forever. Enter Sherry Lynette Townsend. A mother struggling against a tide of bills, overdue fees, and unfulfilled promises. At 47, Sherry wasn't a hardened criminal. She wasn't someone who had a history of violence. But desperation has a way of changing people. She wasn't looking for a fight, not in the traditional sense. She was looking for a way out of a financial hole that seemed to deepen by the day. Sherry's daughter, just 14 years old, had been on a cheerleading team, and they had planned a trip to Florida. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about hope, about keeping a promise to a daughter who had already faced so much. The cheerleading trip was supposed to be the bright spot in an otherwise difficult time. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Sherry couldn't make that promise come true. She had already spent money she didn't have, writing bad checks, juggling bills, trying to keep her head above water. And it wasn't just her family's immediate needs that were at stake, it was her reputation, her pride. The pressure built up, and like so many before her, Sherry turned to desperation. But the desperation doesn't stop there. Sherry begins searching online for ways to make money fast. The camera hovers over her screen as she types, how to get money quick, duplicate credit cards, rob washing machines for coins, and even, sugar daddy. It's painful to watch, the helplessness spilling into her every search. She's looking for a way out, but the choices she's considering are anything but legal. And yet, the fear of failure, the pressure of her promises, her desire to make things right, begins to cloud her judgment. Sherry begins to feel like there's no way back. Leeds, an experienced nurse, had lived a life of care. But there was no one to care for her on this fateful day. Sherry Townsend, meanwhile, had a different struggle. A mother's love collided with desperation, and the consequences would be fatal. Sherry's actions would soon take her beyond the reach of the law. As she roamed the internet looking for ways to solve her problems, she also found herself on the path that would lead her to the promenade on the Peninsula Mall. The mall, the very place where Susan Leeds had come to shop that day, became the epicenter of a violent crime. Sherry had been there, too. She'd seen Susan and noted her. Townsend had no way of knowing that Leeds would be the person she chose to target. But in Sherry's mind, everything had aligned. Her financial troubles, her emotional breakdown, her desperation to make things right for her daughter, all of it had led to this moment. The next series of shots reveals how Sherry stalked the parking lot, her car parked a few rows away from Leeds. She waited, patiently, almost as if she had nothing to lose. Her eyes fixated on the retired nurse, unaware that what was about to unfold would change everything. The scene cuts back and forth, Sherry's eyes, the empty parking lot, Susan coming back to her car. Each moment feels like it's happening in slow motion, the tension building as we know what's about to happen but still can't comprehend why. As Susan gets into her car, there's a moment of quiet, a moment that could have been any other day. But Sherry's patience gives way to action. In that single, violent instant, Susan Leeds is attacked. The stabbing is brutal, 17 times, according to the autopsy report. The attack is quick, methodical, and shocking. It's a crime that seems out of place in this otherwise quiet parking structure. Susan doesn't even have time to react fully. She doesn't even have time to scream. The moment is over as quickly as it began, leaving her lifeless in her car. Her black purse is gone, but her jewelry remains, an indication, perhaps, that the attack wasn't driven by a need for valuables. Instead, it was driven by something else. Was it the money? Was it the mounting pressure? Was it the promise of a trip, of a better life, for her daughter? The reason, it seems, doesn't matter anymore. For 2 hours, Sherry Townsend waited. Then, in an instant, a mother's desperation turned deadly. Susan Leeds, a woman who had spent her life helping others, was now just another victim, another casualty of a crime driven by nothing more than desperation. As the police begin their investigation, they start to piece together the puzzle. The phone left behind, the phone pings in the area, the surveillance footage that shows Sherry's car leaving the parking structure. Each piece adds weight to the growing evidence. But still, they can't connect all the dots, until they realize something even more damning. Sherry had left a trail of desperation so vivid, so clear, that it couldn't be ignored. At the heart of it all was a mother's love and a woman's failure to break free from the grip of her own desperation. But when the truth emerged, it was clear, this wasn't just about money. It was about the lengths to which someone would go to protect their own sense of dignity, to hold on to a promise, and to escape the crushing weight of a life spiraling out of control. Sherry Lynette Townsend's life wasn't always this way. There was a time when she held her head high, proud of being a mother, a provider, and someone who could take care of her family. But in recent months, the weight of financial hardship had slowly eroded that sense of self. It wasn't just that she was struggling, it was that she was drowning in debt, and the waves were crashing higher with every passing day. In the background, Sherry's daughter, 14-year-old Emily, is sitting quietly in her room, her cheerleading uniform neatly laid out on her bed. Sherry had promised her daughter that they would go to Florida for the cheerleading competition. It wasn't just a trip. It was a dream, a chance for Emily to shine. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the stress of their difficult life. But as much as Sherry wanted to make that promise a reality, she could see it slipping through her fingers like sand. The tension is building. Sherry's life is unraveling in front of her, and she knows that there's no way to escape the pressure. Each bill she picks up feels like a weight on her shoulders, but it's not just about paying them, it's about saving face. It's about keeping her daughter's trust, keeping that illusion of normalcy alive. Sherry clicks through articles, reading about schemes she never would have considered in the past. She's not just looking for ways to get money quickly, she's looking for a way to feel like she's in control again. A way to make the impossible possible. She looks at her daughter's cheerleading photos, her excitement so bright and innocent. And then, there's the reality of what's to come, a promise she can't keep. She can't even afford to pay for her daughter's uniforms, let alone a trip to Florida. She searched for quick solutions, but found only broken promises. In a moment of pure desperation, Sherry Townsend sought out ways to escape the reality of her life, each click leading her deeper into a world she had never imagined, one of crime, deceit, and broken morals. Every click on that screen took Sherry deeper into the darkness of her own choices. What began as a search for answers had turned into a hunt for a way out, any way out. A way to fix her mistakes, to save her daughter, to keep the illusion of control. But in the end, there would be no easy answers, no shortcuts, only the consequences of actions driven by desperation. As the investigation into Susan Leeds' murder begins to unfold, the detectives dig deeper into the background of Sherry Lynette Townsend. At first, there is nothing overtly suspicious about her life, nothing that would scream out, criminal. But as they speak to the people who knew her, a picture begins to emerge, a picture that reveals the true cost of her desperation. As her financial world crumbled, Townsend's actions turned from reckless to criminal. For some, her desperation would be a mere footnote. For Susan Leeds, it would be the difference between life and death. At first, her actions seemed like small mistakes, misunderstandings, even lies. But as the days wore on, her decisions became more dangerous. And then, in that parking lot, everything changed. What had started as a mother's desperate need to provide became a crime, one that would leave a life in its wake. Desperation, once a flicker in the dark, had grown into a raging fire. And as Sherry Townsend stood in that parking lot, waiting for Susan Leeds to return to her car, she didn't know that the next few minutes would change everything. For Susan Leeds, it would be the end. For Sherry, it would be the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by the consequences of a crime she never intended to commit. For 2 hours, Sherry Townsend lay in wait. Susan Leeds, unsuspecting, went about her business, completely unaware of the horror to come. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. A mother's desperate need had led her to the most unthinkable of actions. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about what Susan had or didn't have. It was about desperation, the kind that clouds a person's judgment and leads them to do things they never thought themselves capable of. For Sherry Townsend, the act was swift, brutal, and cold. For Susan Leeds, there was no warning. No chance to fight back. Just a life taken in the blink of an eye. As Sherry Townsend drove away, the parking lot fell silent again, but the echoes of what had just happened would linger. Susan Leeds, a woman who had spent her life helping others, was now gone. And for Sherry, the consequences of her actions were just beginning. The path she had chosen was one that would lead her to an inevitable confrontation with the truth. But for now, the silence was all that remained. Leeds' purse was gone, but the rest of her possessions, untouched. Her death seemed senseless, until the investigators began to unravel the trail. A phone, discarded at the scene. Townsend's phone, left behind, tethering her to the crime. As the evidence began to stack up, the investigation took on a new urgency. Townsend's car, seen leaving the parking lot. Her phone, discarded at the scene. The search history, revealing a woman pushed to the edge. Each piece of evidence felt like a thread leading back to her, but there was still no clear answer. And with every passing day, the question lingered, was Sherry Townsend responsible for Susan Leeds' death, or was there someone else involved? The trail was clear, but the path to justice was still filled with obstacles. The investigators knew they were on the verge of something big, but they needed more. The phone, the surveillance footage, the bloodstains, all of it pointed to one woman. But could they prove it? With the evidence now clear, Sherry Townsend would face the consequences of her actions. But the question still remains, how far can desperation drive a person? And what happens when a mother's love collides with the darkest corners of her own soul? For every answer, more questions emerged. Townsend's phone was found at the scene, yet she denied knowing how it got there. The investigation veered in multiple directions, but one thing was clear, someone was lying. The investigation had revealed a woman who had spent days trying to erase the truth, but for every lie, another layer of suspicion was peeled away. Sherry Townsend's facade was cracking, and the walls were closing in around her. With each new inconsistency, the weight of her own guilt grew heavier. Every answer led to more questions, but the truth couldn't remain hidden forever. Sherry Townsend had spent days, weeks, trying to cover up her involvement, but with each lie, the walls closed in around her. In the end, it wasn't the evidence that would bring her down, it was the truth she could no longer hide. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. But the search for justice seemed to stall. A wrongful arrest cast doubt on the case, and the community was left wondering, who had really done this? Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. But the search for justice seemed to stall. A wrongful arrest cast doubt on the case, and the community was left wondering, who had really done this? Sherry Townsend, released from custody, continued to protest her innocence, but with each passing day, the truth seemed more elusive. For Susan Leeds' family, the waiting was unbearable. 5 years had passed since Susan Leeds' death. 5 years of questioning, of pain, and of frustration. But now, the case was reopening. Could new evidence finally bring closure? Or was the truth lost to time? The courtroom was charged with emotion, the weight of the evidence on one side, the defense's insistence on reasonable doubt on the other. Townsend's fate now rested in the hands of the jury. Would they believe the prosecution's case, or would they be swayed by the defense's arguments? As the trial reached its peak, the question that lingered in the air was simple: was Sherry Townsend the killer, or was the truth lost to time? For 5 long years, the truth seemed just out of reach. But in the end, the evidence and the pain of a family's loss led to a moment of resolution. Sherry Townsend, once the center of a desperate search for justice, now faces the consequences of the crime she committed. And for Susan Leeds' family, there is no turning back from the heartbreak, but at least now, they have the answers they had longed for. With the evidence mounting and the courtroom at a standstill, all that remained was the final judgment. Would justice be served, or would the truth remain hidden in the shadows of a mother's crime? As the evidence mounted, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. For some, the truth was already clear. For others, doubt lingered in the air. But as the final judgment loomed, one question remained: would Sherry Townsend be held accountable for the murder of Susan Leeds, or would the truth remain hidden beneath the weight of her lies? The story is far from over. As Townsend faces her fate, the question lingers: how far would you go for a loved one? And when does desperation turn into something darker? And in the quiet aftermath, Sherry Townsend is left alone with the reality of her choices. A mother who once only wanted to provide, now facing the consequences of her actions, understanding the depth of her crime too late. In the search for redemption, there are no easy answers. At the end of the day, the consequences of our choices are what define us. For Sherry Townsend, that choice led to a life taken, a family broken, and a promise that was never fulfilled. But the question remains: when does desperation turn into something darker? And when we face our darkest moments, is there ever a way back? What drives someone to take another life? How far will someone go for their child? The answers may never be clear, but one thing remains: no one is ever the same after crossing that line. We all have our breaking points, moments where our choices seem like the only way forward. But sometimes, in our darkest moments, we lose sight of what's right. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Sherry Townsend will never be the same. But what of Susan Leeds' family? What of the community that watched as the story unfolded? For them, the journey is far from over. As the screen fades to black, we are left with the unanswered question: how far would you go for someone you love? Where do you draw the line between right and wrong? The answers may never come, but one truth remains clear: once you cross that line, you can never return to who you were before. The tragedy of Susan Leeds and the loss felt by her family will resonate for years to come. And as for Sherry Townsend, the question remains: what is left for a woman who has crossed the ultimate line?
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.